The shroud is indeed 2,000 years old, and based on my biblical scholarship, I can assure you that no one was crucified the way Jesus of Nazareth was crucified.
Inside a sealed laboratory in Italy, a small group of scientists stared at a screen and went completely silent. The numbers in front of them should not have existed. A piece of linen almost 2,000 years old was carrying living evidence of a tortured man, blood that refused to turn black, and genetic traces from people who lived on the other side of the ancient world. What is coming next is the kind of evidence that quietly changes the way you read the Gospels forever. The study that shook the walls of the Vatican. The most recent shock did not come from a pulpit, and it did not come from a sermon. It came from a quiet research center in southern Italy in the year 2022. A physicist named Liberato De Caro and his team at the National Research Council in Bari pointed a brand new kind of X-ray at a single thread taken from the Shroud of Turin. The technique is called wide-angle X-ray scattering, and unlike the old carbon dating method, this one cannot be fooled by dirt, smoke, candle wax, or medieval repairs. It looks straight inside the linen fibers and reads how the cellulose itself has aged at the molecular level. Linen has a kind of built-in clock, and that clock cannot be edited by human hands. When the results came back, the team carefully compared the shroud thread to ancient fabrics taken from known archaeological sites. One of those sites was Masada in Israel, a desert fortress that fell to Roman soldiers in the 1st century after Christ. The structural aging of the shroud thread matched the Masada linen almost perfectly. In plain words, the cloth was behaving like a fabric that had been sitting in this world for roughly 2,000 years, not 700. That single result quietly undid the most famous scientific verdict ever passed on the shroud. We will come back to that verdict in a later chapter, because the way it collapsed is one of the strangest stories in modern science. But before that, another bombshell had already landed. A team of geneticists at the University of Padua, led by the researcher Gianni Barcaccia, had carefully vacuumed the surface of the cloth with sterile instruments and pulled microscopic dust out of the fibers. Inside that dust, they found something nobody had prepared themselves for. They found human DNA from people connected to the Middle East, to Western Europe, to North Africa, to India, and even to China. All of those genetic signatures were sitting together on a single piece of cloth. If you stop and really think about that for a moment, it is genuinely difficult to process. The shroud had been touched, kissed, carried, and protected by people from every corner of the ancient world. It was not just a relic. It was a silent witness that had been collecting biological memory for almost 2,000 years. And the deeper the scientists looked into that memory, the closer they came to a body that had clearly suffered far more than any ordinary man. The face that should not exist. To understand why these modern findings are shaking even the Vatican, you have to go back to the moment the world first truly saw what was hiding on the shroud. That moment did not happen in a church, and it did not happen in a laboratory. It happened in a small darkroom in Turin in the year 1898. A lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia had been given rare permission from the Royal Court of Italy to photograph the cloth during a public exhibition. Photography in that era was difficult, heavy, and slow. The cameras were enormous, the exposures were long, and the lighting inside the cathedral was poor. Pia carried his huge camera up onto scaffolding, lit the cloth with magnesium flash powder, and captured 2 glass plate negatives. That night, alone in his darkroom under the dim red glow of a single lamp, Pia began developing the plates. What appeared inside the chemicals was so unexpected that he nearly dropped the glass. The cloth in person looked like a faint shadow, But on the photographic negative, a clear and detailed positive image of a human face appeared, with closed eyes, a damaged nose, a split beard, and bruising across the cheek. For the first time in history, the figure inside the linen no longer looked like a stain. It looked unmistakably like a real human being who had been through unimaginable suffering. And here is the part that even today nobody can explain in a comfortable way. Any normal painting, drawing, or bloodstain produces an ugly and distorted result when it is turned into a photographic negative. The shroud did the exact opposite. The shroud, in person, is already behaving like a photographic negative. That single fact created a problem nobody in the 1800s wanted to admit. Who in the medieval world could possibly have understood the science of photographic negatives almost 800 years before photography was even invented? The honest answer is nobody, and from that night onward, the shroud stopped being a curiosity for pilgrims. It became one of the most disturbing artifacts in human history. And what the next team of scientists discovered when they touched it with their own hands made even the photograph look ordinary. The wounds of a real man. In the year 1978, a group of American scientists known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP for short, were given 5 days of direct access to the cloth. Most of these men were not priests. They were physicists, chemists, photographers, and forensic specialists. Many of them walked in expecting to find paint, brushstrokes, and a clever medieval forgery. They walked out admitting that they could not explain what they had just touched. The first surprise was that the image is not painted. There is no pigment, no dye, and no binder soaking the threads. The coloration sits only on the very top of the fibers, only about 200 billionths of a meter deep. To picture how thin that is, imagine peeling the surface of a hair into 1,000 layers and then coloring only the outermost layer. That is what the shroud image looks like under a microscope. No artist in any century has ever been able to do this. The second surprise was the blood. The reddish stains are not paint. They are real human blood, type AB, full of hemoglobin and serum albumin. Around every blood stain, there is a faint halo of serum, exactly the way fresh blood separates when it leaves a wounded human body. Skeptics had been telling the world for 100 years that the marks were medieval pigment. The science quietly proved them wrong. The third surprise came from a NASA-style instrument called the VP-8 Image Analyzer, originally built to read three-dimensional terrain from spacecraft photos. When the shroud face was fed into that machine, it produced a perfect three-dimensional relief of a real human body. Ordinary photographs and ordinary paintings produce a flat, distorted mess inside that same machine. The shroud produces a sculpture. Something about this image carries depth information that no flat artwork on Earth carries. And when the scientists finally looked closely at the blood patterns, the picture that emerged was so brutal that several of them later admitted they had to step away from their own evidence. The blood that refused to turn black. If you have ever stood near someone who has been seriously injured, you already quietly know that human blood changes color very quickly. Within a few hours, it darkens. Within a few days, it turns nearly black. Old blood on old cloth is never red. Yet the bloodstains on the shroud, even after almost 2,000 long years of handling, fire damage, and folding, are still distinctly reddish in color. For decades, nobody could really explain it. Some skeptics claimed the marks were nothing more than medieval paint or some kind of clever artistic pigment. But every time scientists put the blood under a real microscope, the paint theory quietly fell apart in their hands. Then, in the year 2017, a team of Italian researchers, including Elvio Carlino and Liberato De Caro, carefully examined the bloodstains at the nanoscale using transmission electron microscopy and Raman spectroscopy. They were not looking for a miracle, they were looking for chemistry. And what they found is not the kind of detail most documentaries dare to share with you openly. The blood is loaded with creatinine and ferritin particles bound to hemoglobin. In plain language, these chemicals only flood into human blood when the body is being destroyed from the inside out. They appear in cases of severe and repeated trauma, massive muscle breakdown, dehydration, and shock. Doctors call this terrible condition rhabdomyolysis. It happens when a person has been beaten for so long that their own muscles begin to dissolve straight into their bloodstream. If you sit with that idea for even a moment, it becomes very difficult to keep reading without feeling something. The blood on the shroud is not just human. It is the blood of a man who was tortured for many hours before he finally died on that cross. That biochemistry also quietly explains the impossible red color of the stains. When a body suffers that level of brutal trauma, the liver suddenly dumps massive amounts of bilirubin straight into the blood. The bilirubin locks the red color in place and slows the natural darkening process that should have turned the cloth black back centuries ago. In other words, the cloth is still red today because the man inside it was suffering at a level that medical science can describe, but human language cannot really hold inside ordinary words. The shroud is not just carrying stains, it is carrying the chemical fingerprint of a slow execution. They are arranged like a cap, covering the entire top of the skull, exactly the way a thorny desert plant would have been pressed down onto a real human head. The dust that tells the truth. A medieval forger could fake a face. A medieval forger could even fake blood. But there is one thing a medieval forger living in France could never fake, and that is pollen. Pollen grains are microscopic. They cannot be applied like paint. They settle invisibly out of the air and lock themselves between fibers, and once they are there, they tell the truth about every place a piece of cloth has ever been. In the 1970s, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey Sulzer carefully used sticky tape to lift microscopic pollen samples from deep inside the shroud weave. Decades later, the respected Israeli botanist Avinoam Danon from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem patiently reviewed and expanded that delicate work. Together, these two men quietly identified pollen from 58 different plant species hidden inside the fibers of the cloth. Some of those species do grow in Europe, which makes perfect sense because the shroud has lived in Europe for the last 600 years of its long and well-documented history. But the clear majority of the species are not European at all. They come from the Middle East, from Turkey, and from a very narrow corridor of dry desert land stretching between Jerusalem and Jericho. One particular plant appeared again and again across the entire cloth in surprisingly heavy amounts. Its scientific name is Gundelia tournefortii I. It is a sharp, thorny desert shrub that only grows naturally inside the Holy Land, and it only flowers in early spring, exactly around the time of the Jewish Passover festival. The pollen of this plant was concentrated most heavily around the head and the shoulders of the image, which is the exact place where the Gospels describe a crown of thorns being violently pressed onto the head of Jesus. A second plant called Zygophyllum dumosum was also found, and that one only grows naturally inside the Judean desert and the Sinai Peninsula. No medieval workshop sitting quietly in France had any real access to either of these unusual plants. And on top of all this came the limestone evidence. Microscopic limestone crystals found on the feet and knees of the image matched the rare aragonite limestone found in the caves around Jerusalem. The question is how a piece of fabric that everybody insisted came from medieval Europe could be soaked in the soil and pollen of first-century Jerusalem. The scandal of 1988. This brings us to the most controversial moment in the entire history of the Shroud. In the year 1988, three of the most respected laboratories in the world at Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona were each given a small piece of the cloth for carbon dating. Their verdict landed in newspapers across the planet. They announced that the Shroud was made between the years 1260 and 1390 after Christ. In other words, they declared it a medieval fake. For many people, that was the end of the story. The debate appeared to be over, but the story did not actually end there. It only paused. Years later, a chemist named Raymond Rogers, who had worked on the original STIRP project at Los Alamos, decided to take another careful look at the sample fibers that had been used in the 1988 test. What he found stopped him cold. The fibers from the tested corner were not pure first-century linen at all. They contained cotton, dye, and a plant gum that did not appear anywhere else on the cloth. The corner that had been sampled was a region that had been carefully repaired by medieval nuns, using a hidden weaving technique called invisible reweaving. The scientists had not dated the Shroud, they had dated a patch. When you mix original ancient threads with younger repair threads and then carbon date the blend, you do not get the date of the original. You get a misleading average that lands somewhere in the middle. That is exactly the date the laboratories produced. And that one quiet realization, combined with the new wide-angle X-ray scattering result from the year 2022, suddenly reopened a door the scientific world had tried very hard to close. The cloth had never actually been dated. It had only been judged. And when honest researchers went back to the drawing board, every new method they tried kept pointing to one place on the map and one century in history: the journey home. If the Shroud really did come from first-century Jerusalem, then it had to travel a very long and very dangerous road before it ever ended up inside a cathedral in northern Italy. Historians like Ian Wilson spent decades quietly tracing that road, and what they slowly uncovered reads less like a religious legend and a lot more like a careful detective story stretched across 2,000 years of human history. They believe the cloth left Jerusalem within a few short years of the crucifixion and was carried in secret to the ancient city of Edessa in what is now southern Turkey. There it was folded in such a clever way that only the face of the man was visible inside its protective frame, and across the early Christian world it slowly became known by a haunting name. People began calling it an image not made by human hands. From Edessa, the cloth was carefully transported in the year 944 to Constantinople, which at that time was the great Christian capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and one of the richest cities on earth. For more than 2 centuries, the cloth was kept there as one of the most precious objects in the entire city. Then, in the year 1204, during the violent chaos of the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was attacked, sacked, and looted by Western armies. A French knight named Robert de Clary later wrote in his own eyewitness account that he had personally seen the burial cloth of Christ, with the figure of a man clearly upon it, being publicly displayed in the city just days before it suddenly vanished from history. After that moment, the trail of the Shroud goes painfully quiet for nearly 150 years. And then, in the year 1353, the cloth resurfaced very suddenly in the small French village of Lirey, in the hands of a knight named Geoffroy de Charny. There is one final clue that locks the entire journey firmly into place. Inside a Hungarian manuscript known today as the Prey Codex, drawn somewhere around the year 1192, there is a detailed illustration of Christ being lovingly laid into the tomb. The cloth shown in that drawing has the same rare herringbone weave as the Shroud, and it clearly displays 4 small burn holes arranged in an L-shaped pattern that exactly matches 4 real burn holes on the actual shroud itself. That manuscript exists nearly a full 100 years before the date the famous carbon test once claimed for the cloth. It is one more silent witness gently saying that the shroud was already in this world long before any medieval forger could have ever invented it. When you finally put all of this together, the startled photograph in Secondo Pia's darkroom, the wounds no human artist could ever paint, the blood that refused to turn black, the pollen from a desert thousands of miles away, the limestone of Jerusalem itself, the collapsed carbon test, the brand new X-ray analysis, the global DNA evidence, and the long historical trail leading straight back to an empty tomb, something quietly becomes very difficult for any honest mind to simply ignore. If this video moved something in you, share your honest thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear what you believe the Shroud of Turin really is.